All right. Thanking and praising God for the chance to start yet another book in the Word. This time, the book of Mark. And let's look at the entire book from the perspective of the theme great. Understanding that is not great in terms of just vain grandiosity, but I think one of the low-key themes, at least that stands out to me, is the way in which great things are possible with great compassion. A low-key theme that we will see, I think, picked up in chapter 1, carried on at least through, I think, these first 7 chapters, understanding that they have 2 famous miracles. We also saw in the book of Matthew that were likewise noted for the great compassion that motivated Jesus to carry out those couple of miracles, understanding that most of his acts were rooted in compassion. It literally in the ESV calls out some of these works. And so since I did not emphasize it in Matthew, I want to emphasize it now, and hopefully it'll come together as we look at chapter 1 that I want to call great crowds, a term that's literally going to come up later on in this set of 7 chapters. But Mark's gospel is essentially going to pick up midstream from where Matthew began. And to illustrate that, of course, with the thumbnails I usually try to post, I'm going to list little, I'm going to call them marginal notes, but my personal notes as to the corresponding chapters in Matthew's gospel, at least as I see them through, at least so far, the first 7 chapters. Understanding that, let's just get to the summary where Mark is going to basically cut out the early parts of Jesus' origin stories, that part of his prophesied birth, his genealogy, his actual birth, a flight to Egypt, all of his childhood, and he's basically going to pick up with John's introduction of Jesus, roughly Matthew chapter 3, as it's going to begin in verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. And that is going to seem to be exactly what John does. As verse 4 is going to say, John appeared baptizing, going on in verse 7 to say that he preached after me, referring to what we'll see in some of the other gospels, the whole concept of moving forward. He must increase while I must decrease, something that we will see that is not lost on John, or it's easy to give things up when you haven't done a whole lot. But we're going to see that before we get into the great crowds that Jesus has attracted. Verse 5 is going to talk about the way in which John attracted the crowds even before Jesus did. In verse 5, and all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan. Something that we also saw in Matthew's gospel, but it's going to be very much more condensed in Mark's. Why? Because the very first chapter of Mark is going to really span 8 chapters of Matthew. Going on, though, chapter 3 of Matthew is going to also be something that's shortly summarized in verses 9 through 11 of Mark, talking about the baptism of Jesus as it was done by John, as it is going to go on in verses 12 and 13 to shift to something we would see in Matthew chapter 4, the temptation of Jesus, as it's going to say, after he was baptized, immediately he was driven out into the wilderness by the Spirit. Verse 14 marks another shift or another section of what we'll see in Matthew chapter 4, or what we saw in Matthew chapter 4, saying that now after John was arrested, Jesus did his own preaching after surviving the temptation in the wilderness. Saying in much the same way we saw in the Gospel of Matthew, he preached a repentance similar to the repentance that John preached. Going on, though, likewise, and I want to be redundant with like we saw in the Gospel of Matthew, but like we saw in Matthew chapter 4, in verses 16 through 20 here of chapter 1, he is going to call his first disciples, promising to make them fishers of men. We'll see our first shift away from some things that we saw in Matthew's gospel in Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28, as he will talk in similar terms to what we saw at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The crowd seemed to notice a clear distinction between his teaching, that being with authority, as opposed to what they were used to from the scribes. However, it does not come at the end of the Sermon on the Mount here. It comes, like we said, in a passage or a teaching during his time in Capernaum that I'm not sure the Gospel of Matthew actually mentions. Going on, though, the Sermon on the Mount is not included in Mark's Gospel. And so if we're looking at it by chapters, chapter 1 and 2 of Matthew are missing from Mark's, what seems to be his summary of the ministry of Christ. And then, of course, chapters 5 through 7, the chapters from Matthew, including the Sermon on the Mount, are not included in Mark's Gospel, as Mark chapter 1 will continue on in verse 29 to correspond to what we saw, as we mentioned before, in Matthew chapter 8, talking about the way in which he heals Simon's mother-in-law, and not just her, but many will be healed. However, this account, I think, is going to be a little bit distinct from what we saw in Matthew. Once again, understanding that now he is going to include an additional discussion or side note about the casting out of demons that I think is going to be important conceptually as well, as chapter 1, verses 35 through 39 are going to give us another portion of information that I don't think we see in Matthew's gospel, and that is at least what caught my attention as his need to withdraw to a desolate place, understanding that the crowds are becoming a thing early on, even in chapter 1 of Mark. However, verses 40 through the end of the chapter are going to go back to something we did see in Matthew, and that is the cleansing of a leper. Understanding that, once again, it is going to remind us in verse 45 where it concludes, but he went out and began to talk freely about it, meaning the leper who was cleansed, and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Thus our theme, great crowds. Understanding that that same thing came out in Matthew, but it seemed to take much longer to develop in Matthew's description as opposed to Mark, who pretty much bullet points the portions of the origin story he chooses to highlight, from the introduction of John's ministry on through Jesus' baptism and temptation, only seeming to take a pause and give us extended descriptions of his first teachings and healings and signs of compassion on the people. And as we said, the fact that it produces large crowds. Hitting some of those highlights in chapter 1 from John's crowds, as we saw in verse 5. It is going to then go on and help us understand how in verse 28, the first healings that he does, helping a man with an unclean spirit, is going to produce, as it says in verse 28, at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. Continuing on, it's going to talk about the way in which he healed many, as we mentioned, after healing Simon's mother-in-law, as it's going to say in verse 33, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. Going on to say that as he withdrew to a desolate place, his disciples at this point found him in verse 37, saying, and they found him and said to him, everyone is looking for you. And then finally in verse 45, as we mentioned, even though he asked the leper or commanded the leper not to make it known, quite possibly because he knew it was going to follow, the leper told anyway, and it resulted in, once again, it's not literally going to say great crowds, but so many following him that he could no longer move in the populated places, because they were even following him out to the desolate places in which he seems to have sought at least a little bit of rest. Understanding that, as we mentioned, the thing that might have most caught my attention about the great crowds that followed Jesus has a lot to do with the difference in the way that he built a following. He seemed to build his following through great compassion. Once again, going back to something we did see in Matthew's gospel, and that is the way in which in chapter 14 of Matthew, after John was executed and Jesus withdrew, once again, trying to find some personal time, quite possibly to grieve, the crowds followed him, and he healed them anyway. And that's how this chapter concludes. Not so much with the death of John, but that very same compassion we'll see picked up in chapter 2, where in spite of the fact that he's withdrawing and the crowds are following him, quite possibly cutting into his personal time, he's continuing to heal, even though he is quite possibly exhausted. And that is the low-key implication that I'm saying shows his compassion. But when we see the healing of, the healing of the leper, it's literally going to be a thing that we see in verse 41, which reads, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. Understanding that another, I'm saying low-key too much, but another low-key theme throughout the book of Mark seems to be what we were implying throughout Matthew, and that is faith. understanding that the leper is going to say, if you will, I will be clean. As Christ says, he will. And he doesn't just say it. He touches a man who is generally in that society considered to be untouchable. Once again, demonstrating a compassion that even though it is explicitly described here, seems to motivate much, if not all, that Christ does throughout the book of Mark. Which reminds me of why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please help us to stay focused on the ways in which, no matter how many great things we might want to accomplish, how meaningless they can all be without genuine compassion.